Thank you very much for having me here. I apologize for being the last obstacle before dinner. And I tried to make it as little traumatic as possible. I need a few instruments. Yeah. The question that I would like to discuss with you, in particular also with the physicists and mathematicians among you, is okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's see whether it works. I don't think so. Is whether one can conceive of the possibility that evolutionary increases in the complexity of the brain led to the emergence of new computational strategies that we have not been exploring so far. And I would like to have inspirations from those who know more about computation, more about mathematics, more about physics. We all experience, at least in neuroscience, that the evolutionary increase in the brain's complexity is paralleled by a dramatic increase of explanatory gaps. We understand less and less as we proceed towards higher cognitive functions. While we have been very successful in explaining and accounting for the behavior of simple organisms by the functioning of their nervous systems, and there are some examples like C. elegans where this is nearly perfect, it is very difficult to find mechanistic explanation for higher cognitive and executive functions of the human brain in particular. Here are some examples. One of the conundra is that memories can be accessed nearly equally fast and actually very fast within fractions of a second sometimes, irrespective of whether they are recent or whether they are from our childhood, which means that all these memories somehow must be equidistant in the space of representations and equally quickly accessible. We have no idea how the superposition or the simultaneous presence of potentialities is realized in the brain. Then we all experience that our perceptions are coherent, that our decisions are coherent, intentions, and even our experience of the self is coherent, despite of an extremely distributed organization of the brain, and I will briefly give you examples. And it is equally difficult for us to understand how we can have the ability of metacognition to reflect upon ourselves, and then, of course, the big problem, the hard problem, as philosophers call it, the problem of consciousness, the emergence of qualia from mechanistic processes in the brain. Now, the explanatory gap, or the nature of this gap, is that we know really a lot about the hardware of the brain. Most of the details we think are understood in terms of how neurons function, how they are wired up. We also have, thanks to these non-invasive imaging technologies that have been emerging over the last decades, and also lesion studies, we have a very good idea of structure-function relations. We know where particular functions in the brain are produced. But we by and large ignore how cognitive and executive functions emerge from the large-scale interactions between these many, many local processes. This is a random noise generator. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Voila. So what were the major evolutionary steps towards this complexity that we are dealing with now? First of all, there was a massive increase of the components of neurons. But the nature of those little elements hasn't changed very much, as I will show in a minute. Then novel modes of interaction have been introduced. Simple systems have a fairly linear architecture, input-output functions. In more differentiated nervous systems, other principles prevail. This is re-entry and reciprocity instead of feed-forward. So neurons are coupled back onto themselves. We also have novel architectures. In highly evolved brains, we see an extremely distributed organization rather than a serial organization towards a processing pyramid, the top of a pyramid, which would be the seat of the self or whatever. And then we see that we have an iteration of self-similar processes. There are modules, and I will talk about them briefly, which are just repeated. And they take the computational results of their brothers and sisters and do the same thing again and again and again. And this somehow leads to the emergence of new properties. Now, evolution as biologists all know, is very conservative. The result of this is that the nerve cells that we see in the ganglia of snails have exactly the same properties as the nerve cells in the cerebral cortex of human beings. Some morphological differences, but the basic principles are the same. Also, since the invention by evolution of the neocortex, there are no new structures in the brain. We just have more of the same, and this makes all the difference between the culture-generating human being and our next neighbors, the apes. Just more substrate, nothing, no real new principles. This dramatic expansion of neocortex had a consequence, and this is that in simple nervous systems, and the rat is still very complicated, but we have a fairly short path from the sensory areas in the back of the brain to the executive structures in the front of the brain. While in primate brains, there's so much more substrate added to this short path, which we still have and use for certain tasks, where neurons are located in networks that mainly talk to each other. A neuron in this position here would mainly or exclusively receive input from other neurons in other parts of the neocortex, but not from the sensory surfaces, and they would also not project out to the effector organs. So the system, and you see from these many reciprocal arrows, is reciprocally coupled, allowing for a result that is computed here to send it back to this structure, have it worked up again, send it up here, and then go through these loops. This is a canonical picture of the cerebral cortex made by Janos Centagutai, who was member of this academy decades ago. He was a very, very gifted neuroanatomist, and he was the first to pinpoint the modular structure of the neocortex and to identify the cells in this beautiful structure. Not only the cells, this has been done by Ramon y Cajal and Golgi, but also the connectivity between the cells. And based on his seminal studies, morphological studies, then there were analysis of the circuitry, and you don't have to remember anything of this. Just remember there are about 80% of the cells in the six-layered structure which are excitatory, and 20%, those are the red ones, they are inhibitory, and there are input connections to this structure. There are intrinsic connections which are, as I already emphasized, reciprocal. All these neurons interact among each other, and there are multiple positive feedback loops, which is a nightmare for engineers because these systems have the tendency to run away, but nature has succeeded in preventing this in most of the cases. And then there is a parallel system which we call the modulatory system that is also looped into these cortical layers and takes care of the excitability level of this system, because it is noteworthy that the dynamics that evolve within this system, they are regulated such that they are close to criticality. They are at the edge of chaos, but they are not there. They are just below, which assures maximum complexity of the possible dynamics evolving in this system. Here you see again a sketch of this reciprocity. These modules, which have internal loops, are again connected to each other through reciprocal loops. And this network can be seen as a continuous carpet. The cortex can be seen as a homogeneous, continuous structure that is made up of these modules into which input is mapped and output is taken out. The input-output functions make these areas visible as different, while the internal coupling is completely continuous and homogeneous. If one analyzes the statistics of the coupling, one can record from many cells simultaneously, which is now technologically possible, compute cross-correlation functions, determine the strength of coupling, and then one gets graphs of this kind. One can then analyze them in a more systematic way, do statistics on them, treat them like a network, call those elements nodes and the connection edges. And if one does this, one realizes that one has to do with a small world network. So a network that is optimized so that activity in any of the nodes can be communicated with a minimal number of intervening nodes and a minimum number of path length to any other node. actually the system is, the connectivity degree is 70%. So these 10 to 11 neurons which we have in the brain, or 10 to the 9 in the neocortex, 70% of them can talk to each other directly. This is a fantastic connectivity matrix. Now it is scalable. This here, I don't see whether you can see these many white wires in here. The red dots stand for distinct cortical areas defined by input-output functions of this continuous sheet. And these areas are connected among each other through these massive reciprocal connections, each of them indicated by one of these white lines. And again, if one does statistical analysis, small word network, this is monkey brain, only a subset of cortical areas, only the visual ones and a few executive structures in the front of the brain. The same principle reigns in the, I don't know what it does. In the human brain, one can now in vivo trace tracts using magnetic resonance imaging, using the diffusion direction of water between these fiber pathways, get tract systems, plot them, and here you see only 20% of the identifiable pathways, and we have depicted here 120 nodes only. And again, statistical analysis shows it is a small world network. Now, these architectural features and also the emergent dynamics that we observe really do require an extension of our classical views. We had seen the brain in the behaviorist stance essentially as a stimulus-response machine that is linearly organized and performs linear operations, filter operations. Now, this is entirely incompatible with what we see now. Now, the main evidence that requires revision of this classical view is that, as I already elaborated on, the connectome has small world properties. Reciprocity prevails, re-entry prevails. And then we have learned that the brain is self-active. It is always active, and it always generates highly structured, high-dimensional spatiotemporal activity patterns that evolve, as I already said, close to self-organized criticality. And we believe that the activity that is permanently generated, these patterns, they are forward models of the world. They serve as hypotheses for the prediction of what the sensory signals are going to bring to the brain and then allow interpretation according or as a function of these hypotheses. So perception is the confirmation of anticipated hypotheses. Now, small world networks have a lot of advantages. They support parallel distributed processing. They assure optimal communication among nodes, and they allow, and this is particularly important, coexistence of local processes and globally ordered states. But they raise a lot of problems with respect to our self-understanding and the interpretation of the functions in the brain, because they make it very hard for us to understand the unity of perceptual representations, the nature of agency, and of course the seat of the intentional self. Because what we have is this complex network. This is another brain. This is from the cat. Different sensory areas, visual, auditory, tactile, and limbic. And if one analyzes the structure of a representation of a polymodal object, so an object that can be seen, touched, produces noise, and is evaluated with respect to its emotional connotations by these limbic systems. So one gets a coherent percept of, let's say, a dog or another human being. One then asks the question, where in this system is actually the representation of this perceptual object? The answer is nowhere. It is a distributed, highly complex cloud, spatiotemporally structured cloud. Probably it's a trajectory that evolves in time, which is shared by these very, very large numbers of neurons that take care of different aspects of this sensory object, tactile aspects, visual aspects, auditory aspects. So myriads of neurons being active, talking to each other, and this spatiotemporal pattern somehow generates what we experience as having seen, touched, heard a dog. Let me give you a few examples of these complex nonlinear dynamics that evolve in such networks. We now know that, for example, in the brain, the connectome is 70% all the modules that you have just seen, these little columns, they oscillate. And these oscillations cover a very broad frequency range, and they can be modulated. It's damped oscillators. They can be synchronized, and they can be synchronized over large distances with zero phase lag, despite of conduction delays in the coupling. This is one of the miracles of nonlinear dynamics. And then these oscillations show phase shifts and cross-frequency coupling. So it's a really complicated system of coupled oscillators. Here is what physiologists see when they record from these neuron clusters. You see in this lower trace the discharges of bunches of neurons, small and big needles, and you see that they do this in a rhythmic fashion, and the envelope of this activity, which is currents in the vicinity, currents produced by these neuronal elements, is a fairly regular in terms of biology oscillations. And they occur in very different frequency ranges. They are ubiquitous. They are seen everywhere. And as I mentioned already, they can synchronize over larger distances. They do so in a context-dependent way. If you compute cross-correlograms, you see these very nicely modulated cross-correlograms if those clusters synchronize. And they can do so spontaneously as a function of, well, I will give you the evidence. These dynamic states are made dependent on a large number of central states or modulations of central states. They change with arousal, they change with expectancy, they change with attention, and they take on a completely different pattern during sleep, for example. So there are systems in the brain, I already mentioned them a little bit, which are in phylogenetically or evolutionary ancient structures in the depth under the cortical mantle, which regulate the state of the excitability of this cortical mantle through widely distributed different projection systems that use different transmitter systems. If one analyzes the dynamics of the system as a function of behavior, one sees that, for example, the dynamics are regulated dramatically, actually, by the attention or expectancy state of the animal. So in this case, monkeys were trained, for example, to fixate a spot on a computer screen, and then they were told, they were trained to recognize and to realize that there will be three patterns presented in a sequence, and that a change would occur either in the second pattern or in the third pattern, and they would have to respond quickly to the change in order to be rewarded with a drop of fruit juice, which they love a lot. So they learn this, and then they do these tasks. And what you see here is, for example, a frequency spectrum of responses from the visual cortex of one of those monkeys. On the ordinate, you see the frequency distribution. It's a wavelet analysis of these oscillations. In color code, you see the strength of oscillations or synchrony in a particular frequency range, and the trial time runs on the abscissa. Excuse me. Now, in this case, monkey expects a change to occur in response to the second pattern, so it thinks this pattern is going to change. So it upregulates its oscillations very strongly. This is the green power, the big power peak over here. But this was a catch trial. Nothing had happened, so the monkey kept his expectation up because it knew there was something that would happen for the third pattern, and it still produces these nice oscillations. In this case, monkey knew nothing would be requested here in the second, to the second pattern, but the third pattern would change. You see, the monkey doesn't bother to produce any of these dynamics in this case, but it produces them in response to the third pattern, which was the one where the monkey expected changes to occur. So the conclusion is these oscillations, in this case, they are in the 40 to 60 hertz range, so we call them gamma, but they also exist, as I said, in other frequency ranges. And the associated synchronization, they are enhanced by attention, by expectancy, and by the readiness to act. And interestingly, these dynamic variables, they are not correlated with changes in the discharge rate of the neurons, which is another way for neurons to talk to each other. They emit those spikes and they are transmitted. So we have two complementary codes for neurons. They can discharge faster or slower, but they can also synchronize and engage in oscillatory activity. Now, why is oscillatory activity so interesting? Because it can be used to gate the signal flow in this system. What one observes if one records from two sides simultaneously, one sees these oscillations, and one sees that they phase shift all the time. This is a phase plot, and you see it's all around the clock. But there are certain phase angles of these oscillations that neuron clusters seem to prefer under particular conditions. Now, this is interesting because such an oscillation for an individual neuron means that the neuron goes, take the neuron A, through cycles of increased susceptibility to respond to input, and then they go to cycles, to phases where they are completely unresponsive. They are inhibited, they are hyperpolarized, they don't hear even what others are talking because the membranes are shunted, they are short-circuited. So neurons, when they oscillate, go through these cycles of increased and decreased excitability. Now imagine that there are two clusters that are interconnected reciprocally, both engage in oscillations, and imagine that they are synchronized, phase-locked, so that when this one is excitable and emits spikes, this one is also, and vice versa, so they can talk to each other. While a phase shift out of 180 degrees, which would be the case between A and C, completely blocks communication, even though there are pathways. Anatomy doesn't change. So there is, in principle, a very nice and versatile way to very rapidly change the coupling between neuron clusters and to configure functional networks on the fly, which we permanently do, actually. And one can put this to a test, and one sees, actually, when neurons engage in the proper phase angle and phase lock, they also couple very strongly, as you see here by this deep red color. So there's a versatile mechanism by phase entrainment and phase locking to enable or disable communication among neuron clusters. So in conclusion, so far, coupling can be modified dynamically on the backbone of the fixed anatomical connections by adjusting oscillation frequency and phase. This permits selective routing of signals, which is very important in such a highly interconnected network. You can't just broadcast to everybody. You have to target your communication partners. It establishes transient relations among nodes, so it's a relational code. And I didn't talk about it, but it allows for the nesting of relations by coupling different frequencies. Have a low frequency that modulates the amplitude of a faster frequency and is partially phase-locked M&N relations. So it allows for the encoding of nested relations, which is extremely important if one were to construct any semantic construct. Linguists need this. Mathematicians do it by making brackets, but the brain somehow has to do it also. So perhaps here is a novel computational mechanisms for the ad hoc configuration of functional networks. Maybe, maybe not. What we see is that when the brain engages in conscious...
Summarize processing?
I come to the end, yeah.
Okay.
When the brain engages in conscious processing of some stimulation, some input, one sees a transient period of a couple of 100 milliseconds that coincides with the emergence of the content in consciousness, where large arrays of neurons distributed across the cortex synchronize with very high precision, which is not the case when the brain is not consciously perceiving and not consciously processing information. Now, there is the possibility that these dynamic features could be reflections of much less conventional strategies of information processing that we haven't really thought about in neuroscience, at least. It could be that these very dynamic processes simulate something that is known in the information technology world as liquid computing or echo-state computing. And there may be even the possibility that through with classical elements, within classical, not leaving the classical world, but exploiting this extremely high dimensionality of the dynamical states, the brain or evolution may have been able to simulate something that that we know in the quantum world. Now I will skip this for the sake of time and leaving you with questions that I would like to have answers from you. Could it be that the high-dimensional space that is created by the dynamics of the system are used to permit the superposition of very large numbers of memories as equidistant, the initial question? Can it be that there is a superposition of potentialities, very large number of them, which however are just there and not realized unless they are recalled, and then they collapse into an experience or a memory? Speculation, but for the time being, we have absolutely no explanation for this phenomenon, neither for its speed nor for the holistic nature of these recall phenomena. And the related question is, it somehow resembles, at least this is my naive recollection of what my colleagues from the physics domain tell me, and this may be one of the analogies you talked about. It has the scent of the collapse of a wave function, of a potentiality that becomes real. But I have no idea whether this is at all legitimate to talk about this in our context. But maybe it's worth the effort to try to describe cortical dynamics with similar mathematics as they are used for the description of quantum dynamics. And this is something that has not been done at all, and we even don't know what variables we should measure in order to allow others to do this. So, has evolution perhaps found a way to realize non-classical, quote-unquote, processes with classical mechanisms by just increasing complexity and exploiting dynamics? And so the pressing question for us in neuroscience in the moment is, and I share this with many of my colleagues, whether we have to do something that resembles what physicists had to do when they had to enter quantum physics, so the new era of physics. In our case, this would have, of course, we don't believe that quantum physics or quantum processes are relevant in the brain because it's too big, too warm, too soft, too wet. So all those theories that try to get quantum processes into nerve cells, we don't appreciate very much. But what we certainly will have to do is we will have to enter the world of complex self-organizing systems with nonlinear dynamics that operate close to criticality and are obviously able to explore or to extend an extremely high-dimensional state space, a space in which relationships obtain the status of objects, because our ideas, our cognitions, our concepts, they are objects that are effective, they have consequences. And I would leave you with these questions, and I would like to have answers from you. Thank you very much.